My name is Dr. Vivian Cole. I'm 33 years old. 9 months ago, I was lying on a gurney in the back of an ambulance with 2 broken ribs and a collapsed lung, and I heard my own mother's voice through a paramedic's phone say the 6 words that ended our family as I knew it. Is she going to die? We don't know yet, ma'am. She's critical. Then it can wait. Brooke needs us right now. She's having the worst night of her life. Brooke is my older sister. That night, her worst night, consisted of getting turned down for a promotion she hadn't actually applied for and crying about it in my parents' kitchen over a bottle of Pinot Grigio. My worst night consisted of my car folding around a guardrail on Route 9 at 11:40 p.m. while I was driving home from a 14-hour trauma shift. My parents were 19 minutes from St. Augustine Medical Center. They didn't come for 3 hours and 12 minutes. When my father finally walked through the door of my hospital room, he stopped dead in the doorway, and every trace of color drained out of his face. Because someone was already sitting in the chair beside my bed. Someone he hadn't seen in 11 years. Someone he'd told the entire family was dead. "Mom?" he said. His voice cracked in half. Why are you, how did you? And that's the moment everything I thought I knew about my family came apart at the seams. I want to be clear that this isn't a story about a single bad night. A single bad night is survivable. People forgive single bad nights all the time. And honestly, I might have forgiven this one too, eventually, if it had actually been alone. What made it unforgivable wasn't the 3 hours and 12 minutes. It was realizing, in the weeks that followed, that those 3 hours and 12 minutes were simply the loudest, most undeniable data point in a pattern that had been running quietly under the surface of my entire life. One I'd spent 33 years too close to see clearly. It took nearly dying to finally step far enough back to see the whole shape of it. But I need to take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand exactly what kind of night it was, and exactly what kind of 33 years led up to it. I should tell you what it was like growing up as the daughter my parents privately called the reliable one, because that phrase explains more about my childhood than almost anything else I could describe. I was 7 years old the first time I understood, on some pre-verbal animal level, that I existed in my family as a kind of insurance policy. Brooke, 18 months older than me, had a talent for turning ordinary childhood disappointments into full-blown household emergencies. A bad grade became a crisis requiring both parents' full attention for a week. A friendship falling apart became a reason to skip school and stay home wrapped in blankets on the couch while my mother made her tea and canceled her own plans. I remember, distinctly, being 8 years old and falling off the jungle gym at recess, landing wrong on my wrist. I didn't cry. I walked myself to the school nurse, who called my mother, who arrived 40 minutes later, not because of traffic, but because Brooke had a dance recital rehearsal that needed a ride first. "You're the strong one," my mother told me at the emergency room that evening, squeezing my good hand while a doctor set my broken wrist. "Brooke needs more from us. You've always been able to handle things on your own." I was 8. I didn't have the language yet to recognize that sentence as anything other than a compliment. It would take me 25 more years to understand it was actually an assignment, one I accepted without ever being asked whether I wanted the job. By the time I was in high school, the pattern had fully calcified into family law, unspoken but absolute. When Brooke needed a new car after totaling her first one at 19, my parents took out a loan. When I needed a car at the same age, I worked at a diner for 14 months and bought a used Honda Civic with cash. and my father told his friends at church with genuine pride, "Vivian's always been so independent." When Brooke dropped out of community college twice, my parents called it finding herself. When I got into a 7-year combined medical program on a partial scholarship, my mother's first response was, "That's wonderful, sweetheart, but don't let it make you forget your family." I used to think the difference between us was that Brooke needed help and I didn't. It took a ruptured artery in my own brain, 33 years later, to understand the actual difference. Brooke needed help and was allowed to ask for it. I needed help constantly, throughout residency, throughout 2 brutal years of fellowship, through a pregnancy I carried mostly alone because Marcus and I were both working impossible hours, and I had simply never been given the vocabulary to say so out loud. Somewhere around age 9, I had learned that needing things made you a burden, and that being needed, endlessly, invisibly, financially, made you loved. I spent the next 25 years chasing that particular, poisoned version of love, and it very nearly killed me before I understood what I was chasing. There's a photograph that used to sit in my parents' hallway, me at 16, having just won a statewide science competition, holding a trophy nearly as tall as I was. My mother is standing next to me in the photo, but she isn't looking at the trophy or at me. She's looking slightly off camera at Brooke, who is visible at the edge of the frame, arms crossed, clearly sulking about something. I used to look at that photograph every time I visited and feel a small, familiar ache I couldn't name. I understand it now. Even my proudest moments had been, in some quiet corner of that room, about managing my sister's feelings. This is the family I loved with my entire heart for 33 years. This is the family I would have died for, and very nearly did, on a February night I still can't fully retrace without my hands starting to shake. Monday, February 3rd, 6 a.m. I clocked in at St. Augustine Medical Center for what my schedule optimistically called a standard trauma shift. There's no such thing as standard in trauma surgery. By 6:40 a.m., I was scrubbed into OR3, a 19-year-old college kid, motorcycle versus minivan, ruptured spleen, internal bleeding we almost didn't catch in time. My resident, Dr. Priya Anand, 28 years old and sharp as a scalpel, worked beside me. "Dr. Cole, pressure's dropping again." "Clamp there. Suction. Talk to me, Priya. What do you see?" "Bleeder, upper pole of the spleen." "Fix it." She fixed it. The kid lived. He'd wake up the next morning not knowing how close he'd come to not waking up at all. That's the job. You save a life, and you don't get to feel it. You just move to the next room. I scrubbed out at 10:15 a.m. and checked my phone in the hallway. A text from my mother, sent at 9:52 a.m. Vivian, sorry, autocorrect. "Your father and I are taking Brooke dress shopping for the Hargrove wedding this weekend. She's a bridesmaid, you know. Very stressful for her. Wish you could ever be there for things like this." I stood there under the fluorescent lights and read it twice. My mother had auto-corrected my own name. I felt something twist behind my sternum that wasn't quite hurt and wasn't quite anger. I put the phone back in my pocket and went to see my next consult. At 1:40 p.m., they wheeled a woman into the ER. 61 years old, cardiac arrest in a grocery store parking lot. A stranger had done compressions until the paramedics arrived. I ran the code. 4 rounds of epinephrine. On the 5th shock, her heart caught and held. Her name was Rosalind Feld. When she opened her eyes an hour later in the ICU, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "You brought me back." "Your heart did the work," I told her. "I just kept it company." I didn't know, standing there holding a stranger's hand at 3:15 p.m. on a Monday, that in exactly 32 hours, I would be the one on a gurney, and none of the people whose blood I shared would bother to come hold mine. At 4:30 p.m., I finally had 10 minutes to eat something. I sat in the surgeon's lounge with a granola bar and a lukewarm coffee, and I felt it for the first time. A small, sharp pulse of pain behind my left eye, there and gone in under a second, like a struck match. I rubbed my temple and kept eating. I'd had headaches before. Everyone in this building had headaches. At 6:15 p.m., a call came in. Multi-car pileup on the interstate, 3 critical, all incoming. I didn't go home. I texted my husband, Marcus. Mass casualty coming in. Might be here past midnight. Can you get Lily from aftercare? Already on it, he wrote back. Go save people. We'll be here when you're done. Lily is our daughter. She was 6 years old that February, missing her front tooth, obsessed with a stuffed axolotl named Waffle. I thought about her small, gap-toothed smile as I scrubbed in for the second time that day, and I told myself that this was worth it. That somewhere, some other little girl's mother was walking off a gurney tonight because of me. I operated on 2 of the 3 critical patients myself. A 34-year-old father of 3 with a lacerated liver, a 19-year-old with a fractured pelvis and internal bleeding. I chased through his abdomen for 2 hours before I found the source. Both of them lived. I closed the second case at 11:58 p.m. I scrubbed out. My hands were shaking slightly, the way they always did after a long case, adrenaline draining out of muscle that had been locked tight for hours. I checked my phone. A text from Brooke, sent at 10:47 p.m. Mom and Dad are taking me to the spa Saturday before the wedding. Wish you weren't always so busy to do anything for me. I stared at it. Not with me. For me. My 36-year-old sister, who had not held a steady job in 4 years, who still lived in the guest suite of our parents' house, wanted to know why I couldn't take a day off from cutting open dying strangers to fund her spa afternoon. The pain behind my left eye came back, sharper this time, a hot wire threading through my skull. I pressed 2 fingers into my temple and breathed through it until it faded to a dull ache. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself a lot of things that week that turned out to be lies I needed in order to keep functioning. I drove home in the dark. The roads were empty at that hour, just my headlights and the white lines sliding under the car. When I pulled into the driveway at 12:35 a.m., the house was dark, except for the little amber nightlight glowing behind Lily's curtains. I sat in the driveway for a moment before going in, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I opened my banking app out of habit, the terrible, well-worn habit of checking whether my parents needed anything before I let myself rest. There it was. An email from earlier that evening, forwarded from my mother with the subject line, "Urgent, please see below. Don't want to bother you, but..." Honey, the roof needs work before the Hargrove wedding. Can't have people over with water stains on the ceiling. Contractor quoted $4,200. Also, Brooke's insurance renewal is due Friday. That's another $610. I know it's a lot to ask, but you're the only one who can help right now. Love, Mom. I opened my transfer history without even thinking about it anymore. It had become as automatic as brushing my teeth. $1,400 a month. Every month. For 6 years and 8 months. That's what my parents called the Family Support Fund, a term my father had invented the year I finished my surgical residency and started, for the first time in my life, making real money. $1,400 times 80 months came out to $112,000. And that number didn't include the emergencies, the just this once requests that arrived 2, sometimes 3 times a month, ranging from $200 to $6,000, which I had stopped tracking around year 4 because tracking them made me feel something I didn't want to feel at midnight after a 16-hour shift. I typed in the roof money. I typed in Brooks Insurance. $4,810 total. My checking account balance dropped to $2,140. Another tab was still open from earlier that week, the mortgage refinance my parents had asked me to co-sign back in 2018 when their credit had gotten too shaky for the bank to approve them a loan. Just put your name on it, sweetheart. It's a formality. You won't actually be paying anything. Original balance, $164,000. Amount my parents had paid toward it in 6 years? $0. Amount I had quietly paid, transfer by transfer, disguised as family support. $61,300. Current balance? Still entirely in my name because they had never once made a payment or requested to be removed. $102,700. My husband had asked me once, 3 Christmases ago, sitting at this same kitchen table, "Viv, why do you keep doing this? You work harder than anyone I've ever met, and you have nothing left over for us." I'd said, "Because they're my parents." He'd said, "Parents don't drain their kid dry and then complain she's too tired to visit." I hadn't had an answer then either. I'd just quietly transferred the money and gone to bed, the same way I did that night, the pain behind my eye pulsing in time with my heartbeat as I climbed the stairs. I looked in on Lily. She was curled around Waffle, the axolotl, one bare foot sticking out from under the blanket. I tucked it back in and stood there a moment, thinking, what kind of mother is teaching her daughter that love means bleeding yourself dry for people who never say thank you? I took 2 Tylenol, set my alarm for 7 a.m., and told myself the headache would be gone by morning. It was not gone by morning. It was, in fact, the very last ordinary morning I would have for a long time. I need to back up one more time, to the Sunday before all of this, because it matters for what comes later. 2 days before the accident, my parents had invited us over for what my mother called a small family dinner, code I'd learned over the years for an event with an agenda. Marcus and Lily and I arrived at 6, and within 20 minutes it became clear the dinner's actual purpose was Brooke's wedding. She'd gotten engaged to a man named Dylan 3 weeks earlier. Sweet enough, mildly bewildered. The kind of guy who seemed perpetually one step behind whatever plan Brooke had already made for both of them. And the entire family, apparently, had spent those 3 weeks building a budget I hadn't been consulted on, but was, it turned out, expected to help fund. "We're thinking a fall wedding," my mother said, sliding a folder across the table toward me between the salad course and the roast. "Venue deposit is due in 3 weeks. It's $4,200, non-refundable after Friday." I opened the folder. Inside was an itemized budget: venue, catering, florist, a band, a photographer with a name I recognized from Instagram ads targeting brides with more money than sense, totaling just under $38,000. "That's a big number," I said carefully. "Well, it's Brooke's wedding," my father said, as if that explained the math. "You only get married once, hopefully." He laughed at his own joke. Brooke did not laugh. "We were thinking," my mother continued, "that since you and Marcus are doing so well, maybe you could cover the venue deposit now, and we'll figure out the rest as it comes up, like we always do." I looked at Marcus, who was very carefully not looking at anyone, cutting his roast beef with the exact focus of a man who has learned that eye contact during these conversations only invites him into a fight that isn't his to have. "I just had a really expensive month," I said, which was true. The roof, the insurance, the family fund, running total already past $4,800 for a week that hadn't even ended yet. "Can we talk about this after I've had a chance to look at our own budget?" My mother's face did the thing it always did. A flicker of hurt, quickly weaponized into something quieter and sharper. "I just don't understand why this is always so hard, Vivian. Your sister is getting married. This is supposed to be a happy time for the family, and you're making it about money again." "I'm not making it about anything, Mom. I just need a few days to—" "It's fine," Brooke cut in, arms crossed, eyes bright with tears that arrived, as always, exactly on cue. "I get it. My wedding isn't as important as your job. It's fine. I'll figure it out myself, like I always have to." Lily, 6 years old and sitting between Marcus and me, looked up from her plate with the clear, uncomplicated confusion of a child sensing tension she doesn't have the tools to name. "Why is Aunt Brooke sad?" "Aunt Brooke's just tired, sweetie," I said, echoing, without meaning to, the exact words I would use on my own daughter 36 hours later when she asked why I looked sad. And it wasn't until much later, writing all of this down, that I noticed how neatly that sentence had been handed down the generations. A small inherited lie about who in the room was actually allowed to be tired. I left that dinner at 8:40 p.m. with a headache already forming behind my left eye, the very first flicker of it, though I didn't know yet what it would become, and a text from my mother waiting on my phone before I'd even reached the car. "Please think about the venue deposit. Friday is coming fast, and I don't want your sister to lose the venue she loves because her own family couldn't come through for her." I sat in the driveway of my parents' house for a long moment before starting the engine, staring at that message, feeling something in my chest pull tight in a way I now recognize as the body keeping score long before the mind is willing to. 2 days later, I would be lying on a gurney, and my mother would decide without a moment's hesitation that my life could wait behind that same venue deposit. I think about my own wedding a lot now, in a way I hadn't let myself for years. Marcus and I got married 8 years ago, in a small courthouse ceremony followed by dinner for 20 people at a restaurant I'd chosen because it was affordable, and I hadn't wanted to ask my parents for a cent of it. A decision I told myself at the time was about independence, and which I understand now was actually about self-preservation, some instinctive part of me already flinching from a dynamic I couldn't yet name. I paid for the entire thing myself, out of my residence salary, which in those days amounted to roughly the hourly wage of a fast food shift manager stretched across 80-hour weeks. My mother's only real involvement was a phone call 2 weeks before the wedding, in which she informed me she'd need to bring a few extra guests, 3 of her book club friends, people I'd never met, whom she wanted to invite without asking whether there was room in a 20-person dinner reservation or budget to accommodate 3 more plates. I said yes, because saying no to my mother had never, at that point in my life, occurred to me as an available option. I quietly moved money from my own limited savings to cover it, and never mentioned the cost to anyone, including Marcus, until years later. At the wedding itself, my father gave a short toast that mentioned Brooke twice. Once to note she couldn't be there because of work, a claim I later learned was untrue, since Brooke had simply decided a wedding on a Saturday interfered with brunch plans, and once, bafflingly, to wish Brooke luck on an upcoming job interview she had that Monday, delivered as an aside in the middle of a toast that was ostensibly about me. I remember sitting at the head table in my modest second-hand dress, listening to my father wish my absent sister luck at my own wedding, and feeling a familiar, well-worn numbness settle over the moment instead of the hurt it probably should have provoked. I had by then become so practiced at absorbing these small erasures that I genuinely didn't register it as strange until years later, describing the story to Dr. Patel, who went very quiet and then asked, gently, whether I'd ever noticed how many of my formative memories seemed to feature me making myself smaller so nobody else had to share the room. I hadn't noticed. That was, I think, the whole point of how well the system had been built around me. Brooke's wedding, by contrast, the one still 8 months away when all of this started, the one my parents had handed me a $38,000 budget for over Sunday dinner, had at that point an entire planning committee. My mother had created a shared spreadsheet. My father had already met twice with a venue coordinator. There was a dedicated group chat, which I was in but rarely contributed to beyond the occasional heart emoji, titled, without any apparent irony, Brooke's Big Day, All Hands on Deck. I don't say any of this to suggest my own wedding needed to be bigger, or that I was owed some version of the fanfare Brooke was getting. I don't think that's what I wanted, even now, looking back. What I wanted, what I finally let myself name, sitting in Dr. Patel's office months later, was simply to have been asked, even once, what I might have wanted my own day to feel like. Nobody ever asked. It had never once occurred to anyone in my family that my wedding was an event that required their attention, effort, or funding, because somewhere along the way, I had been quietly reclassified from daughter to the one who handles things herself. And once that reclassification happens, I've come to understand, it becomes almost impossible for the people who benefit from it to see you any other way. Not because they're monsters, most of the time, but because you've made yourself so reliably invisible in your own needs that your absence from the family's attention starts to feel, to everyone, including you, like the natural order of things. It took a ruptured artery in my own skull to finally make that invisibility impossible to sustain. Tuesday, February 4th, 7 a.m. My alarm didn't wake me. Lily did, small hands shaking my shoulder, her voice thin with worry. Mommy, wake up! We're going to be late! I bolted upright, and the room tilted sideways for a second before it settled. I checked my phone. 7:22 a.m. Marcus had already left for an early meeting, but he'd left a note propped against the coffee maker. Didn't want to wake you. You needed the sleep. I'll get Lily from school. Love you, M. I made cereal. Lily ate in silence, kicking her feet under the table, watching me with the particular seriousness only 6-year-olds can manage. Mommy, why does your face look funny? Mommy's just tired, sweetheart. You're always tired. She said it like a fact, not an accusation, which somehow made it worse. At 7:41 a.m., my phone buzzed. My mother. Vivian, did the roof money go through? The contractor is coming at 9 and I don't want to look foolish. I hadn't even had coffee yet. I typed back a single word. Yes. And drove Lily to Brookline Elementary. She turned at the door to wave at me, backpack bouncing, and I sat in the drop-off line for an extra 10 seconds, just watching her disappear into the building, safe, loved, unaware. I drove to the hospital. I had a full slate, 2 consults, a pre-op review, and a 1 p.m. tumor board where I was scheduled to present a complicated pancreatic case. The headache had returned somewhere around the Elm Street light, and by the time I parked in the surgeon's garage, it had settled into a steady, grinding throb behind my left temple. the kind that made fluorescent light feel like a physical assault. I stopped at the hospital cafe, bought a large black coffee and a bottle of ibuprofen from the gift shop, swallowed 2 pills dry in the elevator. By 11 a.m., the pain was a 6 out of 10. By 12:30 p.m., it was an 8. By 3:40 p.m., I was on the floor of the surgeon's lounge and Dr. Anand was screaming my name into the hallway. But let me back up, because the 3 hours before that matter more than anything else in this story. At 1 p.m., I walked into the tumor board conference room. 16 physicians around a long table reviewing surgical candidacy for the week's most complex cases. I stood to present the pancreatic patient, a 52-year-old father with a mass wrapped dangerously close to the portal vein, and somewhere in the middle of my second slide, the room began to tilt. I gripped the edge of the podium hard enough that my knuckles went white, kept my voice level, finished the presentation. Dr. Cole, one of the oncologists, Dr. Whitmore, was frowning at me from across the table. "You feeling all right? You've gone gray." "I'm fine. Long shift yesterday." I sat down for the rest of the meeting because standing had become genuinely difficult. At 2:50 p.m., I excused myself, said I needed to check some post-op labs, and walked, carefully, one hand trailing the wall, to the surgeon's lounge. The pain by then wasn't a headache anymore. It was a spike being driven through the back of my skull with a mallet, and something about it felt fundamentally different from any headache I'd ever had. Wrong in a way my body understood before my brain caught up. I thought, distantly, I should call someone. But who? Marcus was in back-to-back meetings until 5. My parents were shopping for bridesmaid shoes with Brooke, 40 minutes across town, and some old, exhausted part of me still didn't think to call them, because some old, exhausted part of me already knew what the answer would be. I sat down on the lounge couch, just to close my eyes for a minute, I told myself, just until the room stopped spinning. The next thing I remember is Priya Anand's face hovering over mine, too close, her voice pitched high with panic. "Dr. Cole? Vivian, can you hear me? Somebody call a code, now!" I tried to answer. My mouth wouldn't cooperate. There was a strange metallic taste, and then there was nothing at all except the sound of my own name being shouted down a long hallway, fading. I woke up in motion. Everything hurt in a way that felt architectural. Not the sharp, isolated pain of a single injury, but something structural. Something wrong at the level of my whole chest. I tried to take a breath, and it caught halfway, like my ribs had turned to stone. A paramedic leaned into my field of vision, young, maybe 26, name tag reading Colton. "Dr. Cole? Dr. Cole, can you hear me? You collapsed at the hospital. We think it's a ruptured cerebral aneurysm. You're being transported for emergency intervention. Stay with me." Aneurysm. The word floated somewhere above me, too large to fully grasp. My daughter," I managed. "Someone needs to..." "We already called your emergency contacts, Dr. Cole. Try to stay calm. We're 4 minutes out." I don't remember most of what happened after that. The transfer from ambulance to gurney, the flurry of voices, a mask being fitted over my face, bright light sliding past overhead like a tunnel made of fluorescence. What I do remember, with a clarity that has never once faded, is the sound of a paramedic's voice on speakerphone as they wheeled me through the ambulance bay doors, relaying my status to whoever had answered the call to my parents' house. "Ma'am, this is Metro EMS. We're calling regarding your daughter Vivian Cole. She's suffered what appears to be a ruptured brain aneurysm and is being taken into emergency surgery. We need you to come to St. Augustine Medical Center as soon as possible." A pause, and then, tinny and clear through the phone speaker, my mother's voice. "Is she going to die?" "We don't know yet, ma'am. It's very serious." "Then it can wait. We're in the middle of something with Brooke right now. She's having the worst afternoon. The dress shop lost her alteration order and she's a wreck. Tell Vivian we'll come when we can." The paramedic's face, when I glimpsed it upside down from the gurney, went carefully, professionally blank, in the way people's faces go blank when they're hiding something enormous. I didn't have the strength to cry. I didn't have the strength to do anything except lie there and let that sentence settle into me like a stone dropping through still water. It can wait. 19 minutes. That's how far my parents were from the hospital where their daughter was being wheeled into emergency neurosurgery. 19 minutes. They took 3 hours and 12 minutes to arrive. I woke up in a recovery bay at 7:15 p.m., a machine beeping steadily beside me, my head wrapped in gauze, a dull roar of pain living somewhere behind my eyes that even the drip in my arm couldn't fully drown. Dr. Anand was there, still in scrubs, her face pale with the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent the last several hours terrified for a colleague. "Hey," she said softly, gripping my hand. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." Dr. Reyes clipped the aneurysm. "Clean repair, no permanent deficits that we can see. You are, medically speaking, one of the luckiest patients I've ever watched wheeled into that OR." "How long," I rasped, "was I under?" 3 hours and 40 minutes. She hesitated. "Vivian, your dad's here. He just got here a few minutes ago. Your mom and sister are in the waiting room." Something in her tone made me look at her more closely. "What is it?" "Nothing bad, it's just, there's someone with him in the hallway. Someone who came with your dad, and he looked..." She shook her head. "You should probably just see for yourself. I'll bring him in." I didn't have the energy to ask more questions. I lay there with my eyes half closed, listening to the beeping, feeling the strange, hollowed-out sensation of a body that had recently had a surgeon's hands inside its skull. And I thought about that word again. It can wait. And how quietly it had rearranged something fundamental inside my chest. The door opened. I heard my father's footsteps first, quick and heavy, and then I heard them stop dead. I opened my eyes. My father was standing in the doorway in his good church coat, the one he wore to things that mattered to him, and every drop of color had drained out of his face. He was staring past me at the chair beside my bed, where a woman I hadn't seen in 11 years was sitting with her coat still on and her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching him with an expression I couldn't quite read. Grief, maybe, or vindication, or both. "Mom?" he said. His voice came out cracked, almost boyish. How are you? You're supposed to be..." "Dead?" the woman said quietly. "Is that the word you used, Richard? Or was it, 'gone for good, don't mention her'? I've heard a few versions over the years." I stared between them, my head still swimming with anesthesia, trying to make my brain catch up to what my eyes were telling me. "Dad," I whispered, "who is this?" He didn't answer. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost stand up out of a chair and start speaking in complete sentences. The woman turned to me instead, and her face softened into something I had never once in 33 years seen aimed at me by anyone in my family. an expression that was simply, uncomplicatedly, glad I existed. "Vivian," she said, "my name is Eleanor Cole. I'm your father's mother. I'm your grandmother." I want to explain because I know how strange this sounds, that until that exact moment, I had believed my paternal grandmother was dead. Not vaguely dead, not a fuzzy childhood assumption, actively, specifically dead. My father had told me when I was 9 years old that his mother had passed away from a heart condition before I was born. There had never been a grave I visited, but there had also never been a reason to question it. My father didn't talk about his childhood. I had chalked it up to grief. Eleanor Cole was, very obviously, not dead. She was 78 years old, sharp-eyed, dressed like she'd come straight from work, and she had apparently been sitting in a waiting room down the hall for the last 2.5 hours after a friend who volunteered at St. Augustine, a woman named Dorothy who ran the hospital's patient-family liaison desk, recognized my last name on the surgical board and called her immediately because Eleanor had, without my knowledge, been quietly keeping tabs on me for years. "I found out you were a surgeon here 6 years ago," she told me later, once my father had been ushered, stunned and silent, out into the hallway by a nurse. "I read about a procedure you did in the local paper, the pile-up on Route 40, remember? Saved that family of 4. I recognized your name. I've followed your career ever since. From a distance. I didn't think I had the right to do anything more than that." "Why didn't you?" I couldn't finish the sentence. My throat had closed around something enormous. "Why didn't I reach out?" She looked down at her folded hands. "Because your father made it very clear 30 years ago that if I ever contacted this family again, he would make sure I never saw any of you." I believed him. I still believe him, honestly. He's very good at cutting people off completely. I imagine you've noticed. I hadn't noticed. That was the terrible thing. I had spent my entire life being the one who got cut off from, deprioritized, put on hold, told to wait. And it had never once occurred to me that my father had a long, practiced history of doing exactly that to people who loved him, starting with his own mother. "What happened?" I asked, "between you and him?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, the machines beeping steadily between us. "I stopped giving him money," she finally said. "When he was 34, about your age now. I'd been supporting him and your mother for years, a loan here, a mortgage cosign there, always urgent, always a crisis. I finally told him I couldn't keep doing it, that it wasn't good for either of us. He told me I was choosing money over family. He told the rest of the family I'd abandoned them. And then he told you I'd died, apparently, so you'd never come looking." Her mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "I've had 30 years to think about how that story would end for whoever came after me. I didn't expect it to be my granddaughter, in a hospital bed, with her own parents refusing to come because her sister was upset about a dress fitting. But I can't say I'm entirely surprised." I lay there and felt the floor of my entire life tilt sideways, more violently than any headache had ever managed, because in that sentence, I stopped giving him money, and he cut me off and erased me from the family story. I heard, with total and devastating clarity, exactly what I had become to my own parents, and exactly what would happen to me the moment I stopped being useful. I had just watched it happen to someone else, 30 years in advance. My mother and Brooke arrived at 9:32 p.m., 3 hours and 12 minutes, as I said, after the first call. I heard them before I saw them. My mother's voice in the hallway, bright and performative, already constructing the version of events she planned to tell people later. Of course we came as fast as we could. Traffic was just dreadful. She walked in wearing the new dress she'd bought for the Hargrove wedding. Tags I'd bet money were still tucked somewhere inside the collar. And she stopped short when she saw my grandmother sitting beside my bed with her coat still buttoned. Eleanor. My mother's face did something complicated. Surprise, then calculation, then a thin, brittle smile stretched over the top of both. Well, this is unexpected. Hello, Diane. Brooke trailed in behind her, scrolling her phone, and glanced up just long enough to say, "Oh my God, Viv, you look awful," before returning her attention to whatever text thread mattered more than the sister who just had brain surgery. My mother crossed to the bed and took my hand in a way that felt, even through the fog of anesthesia, entirely for show. Sweetheart, we got here as fast as we possibly could. Traffic on the interstate was a nightmare. You were 19 minutes away, I said. My voice came out flatter than I intended, scraped thin by exhaustion. I heard the call, Mom. I heard you say it can wait. The room went very still. My grandmother's eyes flicked between us, unreadable. My mother's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. You were being dramatic, sweetheart. The paramedic clearly wasn't giving us the full picture. And Brooke was having a genuine crisis with the dress fitting. You understand. She's in the wedding this weekend, and I had a ruptured brain aneurysm, I said. I was in emergency surgery for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Dr. Reyes told me afterward that if it had ruptured any worse, or if I'd gone another 20 minutes without intervention, I likely wouldn't have survived it. My mother's mouth opened and closed. Brooke, at least, had the decency to look up from her phone. We didn't know it was that serious, my mother finally said. The paramedic didn't explain properly. He said she suffered a ruptured brain aneurysm and is being taken into emergency surgery. What part of that needed further explanation? Vivian, you are always so dramatic about these things, and honestly, this hostility, in front of your grandmother of all people, is not— Diane! My grandmother's voice cut through the room, quiet but absolutely unyielding. The voice, I would learn later, of a woman who had spent 30 years rehearsing exactly what she'd say if she ever got the chance. Your daughter is lying in a hospital bed after brain surgery, and you are worried about tone. I remember this. I remember exactly this from 30 years ago when it was Richard doing it to me. My mother's face went white and then, very quickly, furious. This is not your business, Eleanor. You lost the right to weigh in on this family a long time ago. I lost the right to be treated like family. I never lost the right to see clearly what was happening in front of me. My grandmother stood, smoothing her coat, and looked down at me with something that made my chest ache worse than the surgical incision did. Vivian, I'd like to give you my number if you'll have it. No pressure, no expectations. I just don't want to lose another 30 years. I took her number with a shaking hand. My father, still standing frozen in the doorway, said nothing at all. Not to his mother, not to me, not to anyone, and eventually walked out into the hallway alone, where a nurse later told me he sat in a chair for 45 minutes without moving. Brooke waited until the room had mostly emptied, then leaned against the wall near my bed, arms crossed. So, are you okay? Because Mom's kind of freaking out about the whole grandma thing, and honestly, this is a lot of drama for 1 week when I have the Hargrove wedding on Saturday. I looked at my sister, 36 years old, unemployed, living rent-free in our parents' guest suite, standing in a hospital room asking if my brain surgery was going to complicate her weekend plans, and I felt something inside me go very quiet and very clear, the way an OR goes quiet right before the first incision. "Get out, Brooke," I said. "I need to sleep." She left, muttering something about how I'd always been so sensitive. My mother lingered a moment longer, opened her mouth as if to say something, then apparently thought better of it and followed her daughter out without another word. I lay alone in the dark, machines beeping steadily, my skull throbbing under the bandages, and I thought about a phone screen glowing at 12:35 a.m. the night before, and a $4,810 transfer, and 80 months of $1,400, and a mortgage with my name on it and my parents' equity growing underneath it, and a grandmother 30 years erased for the crime of refusing to bleed forever. I didn't cry. I was too tired to cry. I just lay there and thought, with a clarity I had never once let myself have before. I know exactly what I am to them now. I am a bank account with a pulse. And banks, eventually, get to close. That was the night I decided to find out exactly how much they had taken from me. All of it. Every dollar, every favor, every year. And then I decided I was going to make sure they never got to take another cent. I spent 6 days in the hospital and another 4 weeks recovering at home before I was cleared to even think about returning to the OR. Marcus took 2 weeks off work. Lily drew me approximately 40 get-well cards, most of them featuring Waffle the axolotl performing surgery on a stick figure labeled Mommy, which the nurses found so charming they taped 3 of them to my chart. My parents visited twice in 6 days. The first visit lasted 11 minutes and consisted primarily of my mother asking whether my insurance would cover all of this and whether it would affect the family's finances. The second visit, they didn't come at all. They sent Brooke, who stayed 4 minutes, took a selfie to show Mom I came, and left. Eleanor visited every single day. She brought crossword puzzles the first week, when I could barely focus on a television screen. She brought real food from an actual kitchen, not hospital trays, once I could eat solids again. She sat with me for hours and told me, slowly, in pieces, the real history of my family, pieces my father had spent 33 years making sure I never heard. "Your father was my only child," she told me on day 3, while Marcus took Lily down to the cafeteria for the 10th ice cream of the week. "His father died when Richard was 22, and I raised him alone after that, working 2 jobs. When he married your mother, I helped them buy their first house. When you were born, I helped again. When Brooke was born 18 months later, I helped a 3rd time. It felt natural. That's what mothers do, I thought. But it never stopped feeling natural to him either. He never stopped needing it to continue." What changed? I got sick. Breast cancer when I was 48. I needed to keep my own savings intact for treatment, and for the first time in 15 years, I told him no. I couldn't send the money that month. Her hands tightened slightly around her coffee cup. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked how he was supposed to explain to your mother why the mortgage payment would be late. When I told him I had cancer, Vivian, his first response was to ask whether I'd told anyone else yet, because he didn't want people feeling sorry for the family. I felt something cold settle low in my stomach. It was, I would realize later, the precise shape of recognition. "I recovered," Eleanor continued. "But something in me didn't. Not toward him. I told him, once I was well enough to think clearly again, that I could help sometimes, but not endlessly, not without boundaries. He told me I'd changed. He told me I'd become selfish. Within 6 months, he'd stopped returning my calls entirely. Within a year, your mother told my sister, your great Aunt Rose, who you've never met, because he cut her off too, for defending me, that I had passed away. He built an entire story and handed it to all of you as fact, and none of you had any reason to question it. Because why would a son lie about his own mother's death? Why didn't you fight harder? Come to the house, call the school, something. Eleanor looked at me for a long moment, and something old and tired moved behind her eyes. Because he told me, very clearly, that if I tried, he would make sure I never saw you or Brooke again in any capacity, and that you would grow up believing I was a woman who had abandoned her own family for money. I was 71 years old, recovering from a second cancer scare, and I believed he had the power to make that true. So I did the only thing I thought I could do without hurting you. I stayed close enough to watch from a distance, and far enough away that I wouldn't cost you anything. I thought about that for a long time after she left that night. I thought about my father, standing frozen in the doorway of my hospital room, staring at a ghost he'd invented to protect a story about himself. I thought about how thoroughly a person can rewrite history when the only people listening are the ones who trust him completely. And I thought, I am not going to let him rewrite this one. By the end of my 3rd week home, I could sit upright for more than an hour without the room tilting. I used that hour, every single day, to open my laptop and start building something I would later hand to a lawyer with the label Exhibit A. I started with the co-signed mortgage. I pulled 7 years of statements, highlighted every payment, matched each one against my own bank transfers. I built a spreadsheet. I am, at heart, a person who trusts data more than feelings, which is probably why I became a surgeon instead of doing something that required faith. And by the time I finished the mortgage section alone, the number staring back at me was $61,300. Every cent of it mine. None of it ever repaid or even acknowledged as a loan rather than a gift. Then I did the monthly family support fund. 80 months at $1,400. $112,000. Then I went back through 7 years of text and emails, every just this once request, every urgent don't want to bother you but, and built a running total of the emergencies. That number, once I finally forced myself to add it all up instead of looking away, came to $34,600. Total, conservatively, not counting gifts I'd given willingly and happily over the years for birthdays or holidays, $207,900. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I called Marcus into the room and showed him the screen. He was quiet for almost a full minute. $207,000, he finally said. Viv, that's a house. That's Lily's entire college fund, twice over. That's early retirement, He stopped himself, ran a hand over his face. I'm not going to say I told you so. You've been saying it for 6 years. I've been saying it gently for 6 years. I'm allowed 1 moment of not being gentle. He sat down next to me and looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. What are you going to do with this? I looked at the number, and then I looked at the framed photo on my nightstand. Me at 6 years old, missing the same front tooth Lily was currently missing, standing between 2 parents who, even in that photo, weren't quite looking at me. And I thought about Eleanor, 78 years old, sitting in a hospital chair after 30 years of silence, still trying to protect me from a story I hadn't even known I was living inside. "I'm going to stop paying," I said. "And then I'm going to make sure they can never do this to anyone else. Not to Lily, not to whoever comes after me." Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand. "What do you need from me?" "A lawyer, a good one, and your patience, because I don't think this is going to be quiet." "Viv." He tipped my chin up gently, careful of the healing incision near my hairline. "You just survived a brain aneurysm because the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally decided a dress fitting mattered more than your life. I am done being patient on their behalf. Get your lawyer, I'll get the popcorn." I want to tell you about the week everything got worse before I even had a chance to hire Deborah Fenwick, because it's the piece of this story that still makes my hands go cold when I think about it. It was the 4th week of my recovery, still weeks away from clearance to operate, when I got an alert from my credit monitoring service, the kind of automated email you set up once and then ignore for years, until the one day it actually matters. "New hard inquiry detected on your credit report." I opened it on my laptop, propped up in bed, Lily's cartoons murmuring from the living room downstairs, and felt my stomach drop somewhere around my ankles. A home equity line of credit, $45,000. Applied for 11 days earlier, while I was still in the ICU, in fact, 4 days after my surgery, under my name, using my social security number, at a regional credit union I had never once done business with. I called Marcus into the room, and together we spent the next 2 hours on the phone with the credit union's fraud department, my hands shaking harder than they had at any point since the surgery itself. It took 3 days, a police report, and a formal fraud affidavit before the credit union agreed to freeze the application pending investigation. It took another 11 days after that for a fraud investigator to call me back with the answer I had already, somewhere in the pit of my stomach, known was coming. "Dr. Cole, I want to be careful here because I can only share limited information," the investigator said, her voice careful in the particular way of someone who has delivered bad news many times before. "But I can confirm the application was submitted online using accurate identifying information, your social security number, your date of birth, your address history, and it listed a secondary contact number that matches a number in our system associated with a Richard Cole at the same address you had listed as a former residence." My father's name, my childhood address. I sat there holding the phone for a long moment, staring at Lily's drawing of Waffle the axolotl taped to my headboard, and felt something in me go entirely, coldly still. "Are you saying my father applied for this loan using my identity?" I said slowly. "While I was in a coma after brain surgery he didn't bother showing up for on time?" "I can't confirm intent, Dr. Cole. I can confirm the application used your information and listed a contact number associated with that name. I'd strongly recommend you consult an attorney." I didn't cry. I had by that point run entirely out of the particular kind of tears that situation seemed to call for. I just sat very still and thought about a man who, 4 days after his daughter nearly died on an operating table, had apparently decided the more pressing emergency was securing another $45,000 against her credit before she woke up enough to notice. When I told Deborah about it at our next meeting, she went quiet for a long moment, tapping her pen against the legal pad. "This changes things significantly, Dr. Cole. Identity theft is a felony. I'd understand completely if you wanted to pursue criminal charges." I thought about it, really thought about it, turning the idea over for days. Part of me, The part that had spent 33 years absorbing every hard edge my family threw at me and calling it love, wanted to let it go quietly, the way I'd let everything else go quietly. But a larger part of me, the part that had spent the last month reading 249 pages of my own exploitation laid out in black and white, understood, with total clarity, that quietly was exactly how they'd gotten away with everything for 30 years. "I don't want him in prison," I finally told Deborah. "I don't think that helps anyone, and honestly, I think Lily eventually growing up with a grandfather with a felony record does more damage to her than it does justice for me. But I want it on record. I want it documented, formally, as part of everything else, so that if anyone ever tries to tell this story as a family misunderstanding, there's a police report that says otherwise." "That's fair," Deborah said. "We can file it as documented but not pursue prosecution unless he attempts anything further. It'll sit in the record permanently either way." The fraudulent application was formally denied and closed within the month. No funds ever dispersed, thanks to the freeze we'd requested in time. But I kept the police report. I kept the fraud investigator's letter. I added them, silently, to the growing folder that Deborah's paralegal had started calling, only half joking, the Cole family file. A folder that had begun as a spreadsheet of guilt-driven transfers and had, over the course of one terrible month, become something closer to a small, quiet dossier on exactly how far two people were willing to go to keep drawing from a well they'd been told, politely, was finally closed. I never confronted my father about the loan application directly before the gala. I wanted him to stand up at that podium, believing he still had control of the story. I wanted him to find out, along with everyone else in that fellowship hall, exactly how much I actually knew. The lawyer's name was Deborah Fenwick, a sharp, silver-haired woman who specialized in family financial disputes and who listened to my entire story without interrupting once, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting so precise it looked typed. $207,900, she said when I finished, tapping her pen against the number. "And your name is still on a $102,700 mortgage balance for a house you don't own, don't live in, and receive no equity from." "Yes." "Dr. Cole, I want to be direct with you. This is one of the more thorough documentation packages I've seen from a client in this situation, and I say that as a compliment to your organizational skills and an indictment of your family's behavior. Most people come to me with vague memories and a gut feeling. You've come to me with a spreadsheet a forensic accountant would be proud of." She set down her pen. "Here's what we can do. We can petition the bank to remove you from the mortgage, which, given that you were the sole payer, isn't unreasonable, though your parents will need to either refinance solely in their names or sell. We can pursue formal repayment of documented loans versus gifts, though I'll tell you now that will be difficult and expensive to litigate for the Family Support Fund portion, since there's no signed loan agreement. And we can, if you choose, simply stop. Cut off all further payments starting today, with no legal action at all, and let the relationship reveal itself for what it is." "I don't actually want their money back," I said, surprising myself with how true it felt the moment I said it out loud. "I mean, I want the mortgage off my name, because that's a real, ongoing risk to my own family's finances. But I don't need to win a lawsuit against my parents to know I'm right. I need them to stop being able to do this. To me and to whoever's next." Deborah nodded slowly. "Then let's talk about what stopping looks like." We spent the next hour building a plan. First, a formal letter to the bank with Deborah's firm attached, requesting mortgage release based on 7 years of sole payment documentation, which under the terms of the original refinance agreement, I was, in fact, entitled to request. Second, an immediate, permanent halt to all further transfers, with no explanation offered because, as Deborah put it, you don't owe anyone justification for keeping your own money. Third, and this was the part I hadn't fully planned until I said it out loud in her office, a way to make sure my parents couldn't simply rewrite this story the way they'd rewritten Eleanor's, telling friends and church and extended family that I had abandoned them cruelly and without cause. They erased my grandmother, I told Deborah. Told the entire family she was dead. I don't think it even occurred to them that it was extreme. I think, in their world, that's just what you do to people who stop being useful. I'm not going to let them do that to me. If I disappear from their story, I want it to be because everyone who knows us understood exactly why. Deborah considered this for a moment. Do your parents have any kind of public event coming up? Something with an audience? I thought about it and felt something click into place with the eerie precision of a bone resetting. Their church is holding its spring gala in 6 weeks. My parents are being honored with the Family of the Year award. My mother runs the family support ministry. My father runs the finance committee. I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Brooke's engagement announcement is happening there too. Apparently, she got engaged last month to a guy named Dylan, who I've met exactly once. Are you invited? I'm the guest of honor's other daughter. Of course I'm invited. I'm expected to smile in the family photo and not embarrass anyone. Deborah's mouth curved into the first real smile I'd seen from her all afternoon. Dr. Cole, how do you feel about public speaking? The 6 weeks between that meeting and the gala were, without question, the strangest stretch of my adult life. On the surface, everything continued exactly as it always had. My parents texted for money twice more, once for wedding-related expenses for Brooke's upcoming engagement party, once for a small emergency my father wouldn't specify. I didn't respond to either. I didn't send another dollar. For the first time in nearly 7 years, my bank account simply held on to what I earned. The silence from my parents about the missing money lasted 4 days before my mother called, her voice carrying the particular sharp edge she used when something wasn't going her way. Vivian, did you forget to send the family fund this month? No, I said. I didn't forget. A pause. Then what's going on? Are you and Marcus having financial trouble? Because if you need to talk about a budget, your father and I are happy to. I'm not sending it anymore, Mom. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I actually checked to see if the call had dropped. Excuse me? I'm not sending the $1,400 a month anymore. I'm not covering emergencies, and I've asked my lawyer to petition the bank to remove me from the mortgage since I'm the only one who's ever made a payment on it. You cannot be serious. Vivian, that mortgage is on our house. You would take our house from us over money? I'm not taking anything, Mom. I'm just done paying for a house I don't live in. After everything we've done for you, she started, and I actually felt a laugh rise up in my throat, sharp and disbelieving, because I genuinely could not think of a single thing she meant by that. She must have heard something in my silence, because her tone shifted, softer, wounded. Is this about your grandmother? Has she been filling your head with things? Vivian, there's a reason we don't talk about her. There's history you don't understand. I understand it now, I said quietly. I understand it very well. I hung up. 2 days later, Brooke texted, Mom says you're being crazy about money stuff. What is wrong with you? This is embarrassing. I didn't respond to that either. Meanwhile, Deborah's team and I built the rest of the evidence package. We requested and received 7 years of my own bank statements from my credit union, time-stamped and certified. We printed screenshots of every text message, every urgent email, every just this once. 249 pages in total, organized by date, each transfer cross-referenced against a specific request. We pulled the original 2018 mortgage refinance documents showing my signature as sole payer of record for the past 80-plus months. And at Eleanor's quiet insistence, we added a section that had nothing to do with money at all. A sworn, notarized statement from her describing exactly what had happened 30 years earlier, and a copy of an old family photograph, Eleanor holding my father as a baby, that proved, beyond any possible argument, that the woman my parents had told everyone was dead had, in fact, simply stopped being financially useful. I want people to understand the pattern, Eleanor told me, signing the statement in Deborah's office with a steady hand. Not just that they took your money, that this is what they do. That I am the proof this isn't a misunderstanding. This is a system, and you were never going to be the exception, no matter how much of yourself you gave them. By the week of the gala, I had 249 pages of documentation, a certified letter from the bank confirming the mortgage removal process was underway, my grandmother's notarized testimony, and a slideshow Marcus had helped me build late one night after Lily went to bed. Clean, simple, undeniable, time-stamped from start to finish. The only thing I didn't have yet was the nerve to actually stand up in front of 300 people and use it. That came later. It came, in fact, on the exact night I needed it most. The Grace Hollow Community Church Spring Gala was held on a Saturday evening in early April in the church's newly renovated fellowship hall, strung with white lights and round tables draped in pale gold. 340 people attended. Parishioners, extended family, half the town, all of them dressed in their good clothes, all of them there, at least in part, to watch my parents receive the Family of the Year award for their decades of selfless devotion to family and community. I arrived at 6:45 p.m. in a dark green dress, Marcus beside me in a suit, a flash drive in my clutch that felt heavier than it had any physical right to be. Eleanor arrived separately, 20 minutes later, and took a seat near the back where my father wouldn't see her until it was far too late to do anything about it. My parents found me near the appetizer table, my mother's smile bright and public. "Vivian, you came! And you look tired, sweetheart, but you came." She air-kissed both my cheeks for the benefit of 3 nearby women I recognized from her book club. "We're so glad you're here for this. It means so much to be recognized." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, and meant it more than she understood. Dinner passed in a blur of small talk I barely registered. Brooke and Dylan's engagement was announced to warm applause around 7:40 p.m. Brooke cried real tears, which I noted with clinical detachment was the first genuinely unguarded emotion I'd seen from her in years. Reverend Sarah Donovan took the podium at 8:15 p.m. to introduce the Family of the Year award, and my parents rose from their table to a standing ovation, my father's chest visibly puffed with pride, my mother dabbing at dry eyes with the tissue she'd clearly brought for exactly this purpose. "Richard and Diane Cole have exemplified what it means to put family first," Reverend Donovan said into the microphone. "Supporting their daughters through every stage of life, opening their home, their hearts, and their resources without hesitation. We're honored to present this year's Family of the Year award to the Cole family." My father took the microphone to accept, launching into a speech about sacrifice and unconditional love that I listened to with a strange, floating sense of unreality, as if I were watching a play about a family that happened to share my last name. "And I want to say," he continued, "that everything your mother and I have ever done, we've done because family means giving without keeping score." "May I say something?" The words were out of my mouth before I'd fully decided to say them. I was already standing. 340 faces turned toward me. My father's smile flickered, just slightly, the particular flicker of a man sensing a problem he can't yet name. "Of course, sweetheart," my mother said quickly, too quickly, already reaching for damage control. "Vivian would like to say a few words about her parents." I walked to the small side podium Reverend Donovan had used earlier, plugged my flash drive into the projector cable that was, conveniently, still connected from the evening slideshow, and turned to face the room. "My name is Vivian Cole," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'm a trauma surgeon. 9 weeks ago, I suffered a ruptured brain aneurysm and collapsed at work. When the paramedics called my parents to tell them their daughter was being taken into emergency surgery and might not survive it, my mother's response, which I heard directly through the phone from the gurney, was, and I'm quoting exactly, "Then it can wait. Brooke needs us right now." A ripple went through the room, murmurs, chairs shifting. My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "Vivian," my father started, "I'm not finished." I clicked to the first slide, the mortgage documentation, 7 years of statements, my name highlighted in yellow beside every single payment. "This is a $102,700 mortgage on my parents' house in my name, which I have paid entirely alone for 7 years, while my parents made 0 payments toward it. This is $112,000 in monthly family support transfers over 80 months. This is $34,600 in additional emergency requests. This totals $207,900 given over 7 years by a daughter my parents left waiting alone in a hospital while she nearly died because her sister was upset about a dress fitting." The room had gone completely silent except for the low hum of the projector fan. I clicked to the next slide, the photograph of Eleanor holding my infant father. "This is my grandmother, Eleanor Cole. For most of my life, I was told she died before I was born. She did not die. She is sitting in this room right now." I found her face in the crowd. She met my eyes and gave a single, small nod. 30 years ago, when she could no longer afford to financially support my father without limit, he told the entire family she had passed away and cut her out of our lives completely. I found this out 9 weeks ago in a hospital room, the same night my parents took 3 hours and 12 minutes to arrive after nearly losing me. My grandmother came within 20 minutes. She had been quietly watching over my career from a distance for years because she wasn't allowed to do anything more than that. I clicked to the final slide before I let myself lose my nerve. A scanned copy of the fraud investigator's letter, my father's name highlighted in yellow, the credit union's letterhead unmistakable even from the back row. One more thing. 4 days after my surgery, while I was still unconscious in the ICU, someone applied for a $45,000 home equity line of credit using my Social Security number and listed a contact number registered to my father at my childhood address. The application is documented with the credit union's fraud department and with the local police department. I chose not to press charges because I don't think my daughter needs to grow up visiting a grandfather in prison. But I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what devoted family man actually means in this household. And I wanted my father to hear it from me tonight, in front of the community that just handed him an award for it. A woman 2 tables over made a small, audible sound of horror. Somewhere near the back, I heard Reverend Donovan's sharp intake of breath. My mother stood up. "This is not the time or place." "It's exactly the time and place," I said. And something in my voice made her sit back down. "You're being honored tonight for decades of, quote, selfless devotion to family. I have 249 pages of documentation that says otherwise. And I have a living witness to a 30-year pattern that says this isn't a misunderstanding. This is what my family does to people the moment they stop being financially useful. I don't want an apology tonight. I've stopped expecting one. I just didn't want anyone in this room to keep believing a story that isn't true." I unplugged the flash drive, closed my laptop, and walked back to my table, where Marcus stood and wrapped both arms around me, solid and warm and entirely unsurprised, because he'd known this was coming for 6 weeks and had spent every one of those weeks quietly being proud of me for finally doing it. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice, high and furious. "We are leaving. This is a disgrace. This is abuse." And I heard Reverend Donovan's voice answer, calm and absolutely unwavering, cutting cleanly through the noise of 340 stunned churchgoers. "No, Diane. What you did to your daughter was abuse. This is consequences." The room didn't erupt into applause, exactly. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, and somehow heavier. I remember an older man at a nearby table, someone I vaguely recognized as a longtime deacon, standing slowly and simply walking out without a word, his wife following close behind, both of their faces set in an expression of plain, unhidden disgust aimed squarely at my parents' table. I remember a woman from my mother's book club, one of the 3 who'd been extra guests at my own wedding all those years ago, without my ever once being asked, leaning over to whisper something to the friend beside her, both of them staring at my mother with an expression that had nothing left in it of the warmth I'd watched them extend to her for years. Dylan, Brooke's fiancé, sat frozen at their table for a long moment, his face working through something complicated, before he leaned over and said something quietly to Brooke that I couldn't hear from where I stood. Brooke's face had gone rigid, unreadable, and it wasn't until later, much later, that I learned what he'd said to her in that moment, because Dylan told me himself, months afterward, at a coffee shop where he'd asked to meet me alone, sheepish and earnest in a way that made me like him considerably more than I expected to. I asked her, right there at the table, whether any of it was true. He told me, "The mortgage, the money, all of it." And she didn't deny a single word of it, Vivian. She just said, "That's not the whole story," and wouldn't tell me what the rest of the story actually was. He turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands, an unconscious echo, I noticed, of the exact gesture Priya had made months earlier in the surgeon's lounge. I broke off the engagement 3 weeks later. Not because of the money. Because I realized, watching her that night, that she wasn't shocked. She already knew everything you'd just told that whole room, and she'd never once thought it was a problem. I hadn't asked for that particular consequence. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy telling this story to pretend I orchestrated every domino that eventually fell, that I stood at that podium already knowing Brooke's engagement wouldn't survive the month. I didn't know that. I didn't even necessarily want it, despite everything. Some old, stubborn part of me had still hoped that night that my sister might hear the whole truth and choose, finally, to see it differently. She didn't. That was her choice to make, not mine. And watching her make it, watching her sit perfectly still at that table, unsurprised, unmoved, already calculating what the fallout might cost her personally, rather than what it revealed about a lifetime of unexamined comfort, taught me more about the actual shape of my family than almost anything else that happened that year. I found out, eventually, that Brooke had known about the mortgage the entire time. Not the exact numbers, maybe, but the broad shape of it. That I was the one paying, that our parents weren't. She'd known. And she'd never once said a word, because the arrangement had never cost her anything and had, in fact, funded a fairly comfortable life for her to continue living rent-free in our parents' guest suite, while I quietly bled out 7 years of my own savings 2 states away. I don't know when exactly I stopped being surprised by that particular piece of information. I only know that by the time I learned it, sometime in early summer, it landed with barely a ripple. One more confirmation of a pattern I'd already, finally, stopped expecting to be an exception to. I hadn't planned for it to spread. I'd given permission for the church's media volunteer to record the evening the way they recorded every gala for the parish newsletter, and I'd signed the standard release without thinking much about it, focused entirely on getting through the speech itself. I found out later that at least a dozen guests had also been filming on their phones, and that within an hour of the gala ending, 3 different clips of my speech were already circulating in a private parish Facebook group. By Sunday morning, the combined view count across platforms was around 90,000. By Sunday night, it had crossed 400,000. By the following Wednesday, it was over 1.1 million. And my phone had started ringing with numbers I didn't recognize. 2 local news producers, 1 podcast host, and, memorably, a woman claiming to be a family reconciliation coach who wanted to offer her services pro bono for the exposure. Marcus showed me the comments Sunday morning, scrolling through them with the particular horrified fascination of a man watching a slow-motion car crash he agreed with completely. This woman almost died, and her own parents didn't come. I'm sobbing. The grandmother twist is insane. They faked her death? That's not toxic. That's criminal. $207,900. And they couldn't drive 20 minutes. I hope she never sends them another dime. I'm a surgeon too, and this hits different. We give and give and give. And nobody ever asks if we're okay. Grace Hollow Church better be rescinding that award, or I'm never trusting a Family of the Year plaque again. I turned my phone off by Sunday afternoon. Monday morning, a blocked number called through anyway, and something made me pick up. Dr. Cole, this is Michael Ashworth. I'm an attorney representing your parents. They're requesting a cease and desist regarding the video from Saturday's event and any further distribution. I actually laughed. Mr. Ashworth, I gave documented, signed consent for that footage to be recorded. Every financial record I showed is my own bank documentation, which I own outright. Every claim I made is backed by 249 pages of evidence and a notarized witness statement. I genuinely welcome the chance to present all of it in court, if that's the direction they'd like to take this. There was a pause on the other end that told me everything I needed to know. I'll relay that to my clients. Please do. Marcus, listening from across the kitchen, mouthed, "That was hot," at me once I hung up, and I laughed for what felt like the first time in months. A real, full laugh. The kind that used to come easily before 7 years of quiet financial bleeding had worn it down to something thinner. The hospital found out before I'd even had a chance to decide whether I wanted them to. Dr. Anand texted me Sunday afternoon, 4 hours after the second wave of view counts had crossed 500,000. Vivian. Vivian! Is this you? Everyone in the surgeon's lounge is watching this on someone's phone right now. I walked into St. Augustine on Monday morning for a scheduled follow-up appointment with my own neurosurgeon, and the front desk staff, 3 nurses I'd worked alongside for years, all looked up at once with an expression I can only describe as reverent. One of them, a woman named Carla, who'd assisted me on probably 200 cases over the years, came around the desk and hugged me without asking first. "I watched it 11 times," she said. "I made my husband watch it. He cried, and he never cries." Dr. Reyes, the neurosurgeon who had clipped my aneurysm, pulled me aside after my appointment. His usual clinical reserve softened into something almost paternal. "Dr. Cole, I want you to know, I don't say this to many patients, especially not colleagues, but I've thought about your case more than almost any other I've handled this year. Not the surgery. The surgery was clean. I've thought about the fact that you were on that couch alone for God knows how long, with nobody checking on you because everyone assumed someone else was handling it. I want you to promise me you're building a life now where that never happens to you again." "I am," I told him, and I meant it with my whole chest. By midweek, a local news producer from Channel 9 had reached out, gently, respectfully, asking if I'd be willing to do a short sit-down interview about medical burnout and family caregiving expectations, careful not to frame it as tabloid gossip. I said yes, mostly because the angle she pitched felt true to something larger than my own family, the quiet, invisible expectation, especially placed on women, especially placed on the ones who are good at holding things together, that competence is a substitute for care, and that the people best equipped to survive without help are somehow the ones who need it least. I sat across from the reporter, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Denise Whitaker, in my own living room, Lily's drawing still taped to the fridge visible in the background of the shot, and I told the truth, as plainly as I knew how to tell it. "I think a lot of people watched that video and saw a viral family scandal," I told her. "But what I actually want people to take away from it is smaller than that, and maybe more useful. If you are the person in your family who everyone calls strong, ask yourself honestly whether that word is doing something for you, or whether it's just a nicer way of saying, the one whose pain we've all agreed not to notice." The clip of that specific quote ended up getting clipped and shared even more widely than the original gala footage, reposted by therapists and family dynamics accounts with captions like, "This needs to be taught in schools," and the reliable one always pays for it eventually. I didn't chase any of it. I turned my phone off most evenings and focused on Lily's bedtime routine and Marcus's terrible attempts at pancakes and the slow, unglamorous work of actually healing, which turns out to look a lot less like a viral moment and a lot more like sitting quietly in a therapist's office once a week, saying true things out loud for the first time in your life and watching them not destroy you. 2 weeks later, Deborah called with good news. The bank had formally approved my removal from the mortgage. My parents were now solely responsible for the remaining $102,700 balance on a house they could not, based on their income alone, afford the monthly payment for. "What happens if they can't pay?" I asked. "They refinance in their names only, at whatever rate they qualify for, or they sell." Deborah's tone was matter-of-fact, professional, entirely without judgment. "They face the consequences most adults face when they've been living beyond their means for years, Dr. Cole. It's not your problem to solve anymore." I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up. It didn't feel real yet. 7 years of automatic guilt doesn't dissolve in a single phone call, no matter how badly you want it to. My father called me once, 10 days after the gala, on a Tuesday evening while I was helping Lily with a puzzle on the living room floor. I almost didn't answer. Some old reflex, worn smooth by 33 years of use, made me pick up anyway. Vivian. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, none of the performative warmth he usually led with. I need to talk to you. I'm listening. What you did at that gala, you humiliated your mother and me in front of everyone we know. Our friends, our church. People are looking at us differently now. Do you understand what that's done to us? I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, watching Lily fit a puzzle piece into place with the fierce concentration only 6-year-olds bring to jigsaw puzzles. Dad, I understand it completely, I finally said. Because that's exactly what it felt like to lie on a gurney and hear my own mother say my dying could wait. I just made it visible to other people. You'd been making me feel that way privately for years. That's not fair. We love you. We've always loved you. I believe you love me the way you understand love, I said, and I meant it as honestly as I could manage. I don't think you woke up one day and decided to hurt me on purpose. I think you learned a long time ago that love and money were the same currency, and you spent mine because I never once told you the account was running dry. That's on both of us, in a way. But the loan application, Dad, the one you filed using my identity while I was unconscious in the ICU, that wasn't love, misunderstood or otherwise. That was a choice. A specific, deliberate choice made about a daughter you thought might not wake up to notice. The silence on the line stretched so long I checked to see if the call had dropped. I panicked, he finally said, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child. The house. We were behind, and I didn't know what else to do, and I thought if I could just get ahead of it before I woke up and found out, I finished for him. I know, Dad. I read the timeline. I know exactly what you did and exactly when you did it. I'm your father. You are, I said. And I'm your daughter. And I nearly died, and the first calculation you made when you thought I might not survive it wasn't how to say goodbye to me. It was how to access another $45,000 before anyone else could stop you. I don't know what to do with that, Dad. I've tried for 10 days to find a version of that sentence that doesn't mean what it obviously means, and I can't find one. He didn't have an answer. I don't think in 33 years I had ever once heard my father go completely silent in the middle of a conversation he'd started, but he did that night. And eventually, very quietly, he said, I don't know how to fix this. I don't think you can fix it with a phone call, I said, gently, because some old, stubborn part of me still loved him even then, even furious, even certain. I think if you actually want to fix it, it takes years. And it starts with things like paying your own mortgage and staying out of my credit report, and maybe, eventually, calling your own mother and apologizing for telling an entire family she was dead. I'm not closing the door completely, Dad. But I'm also not going to hold it open for you anymore. If you want back through it, you're going to have to do the work of walking through it yourself. He said he'd think about it. He hung up without saying he loved me, which was, in its own quiet way, the most honest thing he'd said in the entire call. Because for the first time in my life, he didn't reach for the word as a tool to end an uncomfortable conversation. Whether that meant something was finally beginning to change in him, or whether he simply didn't have the energy left to perform it that night, I genuinely don't know. 9 months later, as I write this, he still hasn't called again. 3 days after that conversation, Brooke texted for the first time since the gala. "You ruined everything. Mom and Dad might lose the house. Dylan's parents are asking questions about the video. Are you happy now?" I looked at it for a long time before I typed back. I didn't ruin anything. I stopped funding it. There's a difference. Also, you're 36 years old. It might be time to get a job. I hit send. Then I blocked her number, closing that particular door with a quiet finality that felt less like anger and more like relief. Priya found me in the surgeon's lounge on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, 2 coffees in hand, and sat down across from me without asking if I wanted company, which, I'd come to learn over the past several months, was exactly the right instinct to have around me. "Can I tell you something?" she said, sliding one coffee across the table. "I watched your gala video probably 15 times, and the 5th or 6th time, I started crying. And I couldn't figure out why because it isn't even my family." "What was it?" She turned her coffee cup slowly between her hands, not quite looking at me. "My parents immigrated from Gujarat when I was 4. They worked brutal hours running a motel outside Cleveland so I could go to medical school. I love them enormously. But there's this expectation, this weight that gets placed on the kid who's good at things, the one who doesn't complain. I've sent them money every month since residency, Vivian. Not because they've ever asked cruelly or been unkind about it the way your parents were. They're genuinely loving people. They'd never abandon me in a hospital. But I've never once, in 9 years, asked myself whether the amount I send is sustainable, or whether I even have a choice in the matter anymore, because good daughters help their families was just the water I grew up swimming in. I never questioned it until I watched you stand up at that podium and question it in front of 300 people. I sat with that for a moment, watching a colleague I respected enormously turn over the exact same quiet devastation I'd only recently found language for myself. "It's not the same situation," I said carefully. "My parents left me to nearly die. That's a different category of harm than a family that loves you and just never taught you where the boundary is supposed to go." "I know, I'm not trying to make it about me." She finally looked up. "I guess I just wanted to say thank you. Not for the drama of it, for proving that you can love people and still tell the truth about what they've cost you. I don't think I ever believed those two things could coexist until I watched you do it." We didn't solve anything that afternoon. Priya's relationship with her own parents remained, as far as I know, warm and complicated and entirely her own to navigate. But I noticed over the following months small shifts in how she talked about her own boundaries, a therapist she started seeing, a monthly transfer amount she quietly renegotiated with her parents over a difficult, loving phone call she told me about afterward, with something like relief in her voice. I hadn't set out to change anyone else's life that night at the gala. I'd only meant to stop losing my own. But I've come to understand, in the months since, that the two things were never really separate. That every person willing to finally say a hard, true thing out loud gives the people around them a small, unexpected kind of permission to do the same. The following Friday, Reverend Donovan called personally. "Vivian, I wanted you to hear this from me directly. The parish council reviewed the footage and the documentation you provided at your grandmother's request. We're rescinding the Family of the Year award." "You don't have to do that on my account." "We're not doing it on your account. We're doing it because we gave an award celebrating family devotion to people who told their own child it could wait while she nearly died, and who fabricated a woman's death to erase her from a family for the crime of setting a boundary. That's not an oversight we can quietly forget. She paused. Your father is also stepping down from the finance committee, and your mother from the family support ministry, effective immediately. The irony of that last detail, my mother, architect of the family support fund that had drained me for 7 years, being removed from a ministry literally named for family support, was not lost on either of us. 41 parish families have reached out wanting to apologize to you directly, Reverend Donovan added, for not seeing it sooner. They don't owe me an apology, I said. They didn't know. My parents are very good at making sure people don't know. The most unexpected phone call of that entire spring came in mid-May from a woman with a warm, slightly hesitant voice who introduced herself as Rose Kowalczyk. It took me a moment to place the name. My grandmother had mentioned her only once, in that first conversation in my hospital room. Your great-aunt Rose, who you've never met, because he cut her off too, for defending me. I saw the video, Rose said after a long pause in which I could hear her take a steadying breath. I've thought about calling for weeks. I'm your grandfather's younger sister, Vivian, your great-aunt. Eleanor and I were close, once, before Richard decided the whole family had to choose sides. I chose Eleanor. I paid for it the same way she did. We talked for almost 2 hours that first call. Rose was 74, living 4 hours away in a small town I'd never had any reason to visit, and she filled in pieces of family history I hadn't even known were missing. Stories about my grandfather, dead before I was born, about a version of my father as a boy that sounded almost unrecognizable, sweet and anxious and desperate to please a father of his own who'd been, by every account, considerably harder on him than anyone had ever been on me. It didn't excuse anything, but it added a dimension to the story I hadn't expected and hadn't necessarily wanted and needed anyway. The understanding that cruelty, in families like mine, rarely begins with the person currently wielding it. I'm not asking you to forgive your father because of any of this, Rose told me carefully. I just think it's worth knowing that the pattern didn't start with him either. Doesn't make what he did to you right, might make it easier to understand someday, if you ever want to. Rose came to visit for the first time in June, driving the 4 hours herself, arriving with a photo album I hadn't known existed, pictures of my father as a boy, of Eleanor young and laughing at some long-gone family gathering, of a whole extended branch of relatives I'd never once been told about. Lily was fascinated by the old photographs, asking 100 questions about people whose names she was hearing for the first time in her life. Eleanor and Rose sat together on my back porch that evening, 2 women in their 70s and 80s, picking their friendship back up after 30 years of enforced silence with the easy, unhurried grace of people who'd simply been waiting. You gave us this, Eleanor told me quietly, watching Lily show Rose her stuffed axolotl with great ceremony. You didn't just stop the bleeding, Vivian. You gave 2 old women their family back. I hadn't thought of it that way until she said it. I'd been so focused on what I was finally refusing to give, the money, the silence, the endless benefit of the doubt, that I hadn't fully registered what I was, almost by accident, building in its place. A family that showed up. A family that told the truth even when it cost something. A family, finally, that looked less like a ledger and more like an actual home. My father's house went on the market in late May, listed at $340,000. Emma, Lily, my hands still slip sometimes, even months later. Muscle memory from a lifetime of putting other people's needs ahead of exact accuracy about my own life. Noticed the sign when we drove past on the way to a friend's birthday party in June. Mommy, is that Grandma's house? Why does it have a for sale sign? They're moving somewhere smaller, sweetheart. Because they don't have your money anymore? She was 6 years old, and she understood it more clearly than the 340 adults at the gala had needed a slideshow to understand it. Yes, baby, I said. Because they don't have my money anymore. Good, Lily said, matter of fact, already looking back out the window at something more interesting. Now can we get ice cream? I laughed until my eyes stung. I started seeing a therapist in May, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patel, who specialized in what she called, on our very first session, parentification and caretaker burnout, a phrase I wrote down in my phone that night because I'd never once, in 33 years of surviving inside my family, had a name for the thing that had been happening to me. You were essentially cast as a parent to your own parents, she told me during our third session, while I sat on her couch picking at a loose thread on a throw pillow, feeling, absurdly, like I owed her an apology for taking up an hour of her time with problems that felt, some days, embarrassingly small compared to what she probably heard from other patients. A financial parent, an emotional one. Your job from a very young age was to be the stable one, so that everyone else could afford to fall apart. Children who grow up in that role often develop what looks, on the surface, like enormous competence and resilience. You became a surgeon, Dr. Cole. That is not a small thing. But underneath it, there's frequently a belief, laid down so early it feels like fact rather than programming, that your own needs are a burden other people shouldn't have to carry. That sounds, I said slowly, exactly like every performance review I've ever gotten. Exceptionally capable under pressure, rarely asks for help. Right, and here's the cruelty of it. The very qualities that make you excellent at your job, the ones everyone praises, are often the direct result of a childhood wound. You learn to be endlessly capable because somewhere very young, you learned that needing things made you unlovable. She let that sit in the room for a moment. I'd like you to try something this week. I'd like you to ask someone for help with something small and inconsequential. Not a medical emergency, not a crisis, just something ordinary. And pay attention to how it feels in your body. I asked Marcus 3 days later to pick up milk on his way home, something I would normally have simply handled myself even on an exhausted post-call day, rather than add one more thing to his plate. It sounds almost comically small, writing it down now, but I remember standing in the kitchen after I sent that text, waiting for a response, feeling a genuine, physical wave of anxiety move through my chest, a fear, entirely disproportionate to the request, that I had just proven myself to be exactly the kind of burden I'd spent my whole life terrified of becoming. He wrote back, "On it. Anything else while I'm there?" I cried in my kitchen over a text about milk. Dr. Patel, when I told her about it the following week, said that was, in her professional opinion, enormous progress. Eleanor and I spent a lot of that spring rebuilding 30 years in small, deliberate pieces. She told me, over many Sunday dinners, about the life she'd built for herself in the years my father had erased her from. A modest apartment 2 towns over, a part-time job at a fabric store she'd kept well past retirement age because, she admitted, it gave her somewhere to be. A small circle of friends from her church choir who knew nothing about the grandchildren she quietly wasn't allowed to see. She'd never remarried after my grandfather's death. She'd never had another child. For 3 decades, Her entire remaining family had consisted of people who believed she was dead, and a granddaughter she watched grow up entirely through newspaper clippings and, later, a hospital's public surgical roster. "I want you to know something," she told me one Sunday evening in late April, while Lily colored at the kitchen table and Marcus washed dishes within easy earshot. "I don't need anything from you, Vivian. I'm not telling you all of this so you'll feel obligated to fill some hole in my life. I've made my peace with a great deal of loss. I'm telling you because I think you deserve the truth, finally, after 33 years of not having it." "I want you here," I told her, and meant it completely. "Not out of obligation. Lily adores you. I think some part of me has been waiting my whole life for someone in this family to just show up, consistently, without needing anything back." "Then I'll show up," she said simply, "for as long as I'm able." She was 78 years old that spring, sharp and steady. But I noticed, over the months that followed, small things. A slight tremor in her left hand some mornings, a fatigue she tried gently to hide, a cardiologist appointment she mentioned once and then changed the subject from quickly. I didn't push. I understood, better than most people could, the particular instinct to minimize your own frailty in front of people you're afraid of burdening. Instead, I simply made sure she never had to ask twice for anything, the exact opposite of the role I'd played my entire life. And something about that reversal, being the one who noticed, who offered before being asked, who showed up without being summoned by a crisis, felt like its own quiet form of healing. Late one night in June, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and started typing a letter I already knew I would never send. "Dear Mom and Dad, I'm not going to mail this. I just need to write it down somewhere outside of my own head. You taught me that my worth was measured in what I could give you, not in who I actually was. I believed that for 33 years. I believed it so completely that I nearly died on a gurney while you decided a dress fitting mattered more than whether I lived. Here's what you never taught me. You never taught me that I was allowed to be loved without earning it every single month. You never taught me that no is a complete sentence. You never taught me that my career, the thing I built with my own two hands out of nothing, wasn't a resource for you to draw from. It was a threat, because it meant I could eventually stop needing you. And a daughter who doesn't need you is a daughter you can't control. I understand now why you erased your own mother for doing the exact same thing I've done. It's the family pattern. I'm just the first one who found out about it in time to stop it before it finished eating me alive. I'm not angry anymore, not really. I'm just done. Vivian. I read it back 4 times, crying twice, and then I closed the laptop without saving it. I deleted the draft the next morning, not out of fear, but out of something that felt, for the first time, genuinely like freedom. They hadn't earned my words anymore, not even the ones I never planned to send. 6 months after the accident, on a cold morning in early August, I walked into OR3 at St. Augustine, the same room where, 6 months earlier, I'd operated on a 19-year-old motorcycle accident victim the day before my own body had nearly failed me on that surgeon's lounge couch. Today's patient was a 29-year-old woman, drunk driver on the interstate, fractured ribs, collapsed lung, almost exactly the injuries I'd carried out of my own accident, though I hadn't consciously chosen the parallel. The surgery took 2 hours and 50 minutes. It went well. When I walked into recovery afterward, the patient's mother was already there, having driven 3 hours through the night the moment she got the call, refusing to leave the hallway, even to eat. She grabbed both my hands the second she saw me. "Thank you," she said, tears running freely down her face. "Thank you for saving my daughter." I watched her hold her daughter's hand, unconditional and immediate and entirely without a spreadsheet attached to it, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 7 years finally, quietly, let go. Priya found me afterward in the surgeon's lounge, the same couch, the same fluorescent lights. "You good?" "Yeah," I said, and meant it. "I'm good." "Thinking about your parents?" "No," I said, and this time it wasn't even close to a lie. "I'm thinking about Lily, about the kind of mother I want to be for her." "What kind is that?" "The kind who shows up." I scrubbed out, caught my own reflection in the steel basin, a thin, white scar tracing near my hairline where the surgeons had gone in, a permanent, quiet reminder of the night everything changed. My phone buzzed. Marcus. "Lily wants to know if you're coming to her kindergarten graduation ceremony Friday. It's at 9 a.m., right in the middle of your usual OR block." I didn't hesitate for even a second. "Front row," I typed back. "I'll be there. I already switched my whole schedule." Because that, I finally learned, at 33 years old and 11 weeks post-craniotomy, is what family actually means. Not a monthly transfer, not a co-signed loan, not silence purchased at $1,400 a month. It means showing up, especially, and maybe most of all, when it's inconvenient. My grandmother, Eleanor, comes to dinner every Sunday now. Lily calls her Grandma Elle and has never once asked why we didn't know about her before, the way children accept new joy without needing to interrogate the shape of the hole it fills. My parents' house sold in July for $335,000. After paying off the mortgage and closing costs, I heard through a cousin that they moved into a 2-bedroom rental across town. I don't know the exact number they netted, and for the first time in 7 years, I've realized I genuinely don't need to know. It isn't my number to track anymore. Brooke reached out once more, in September, a long message about how she'd finally started job hunting and things were really hard right now. And did I think we could talk? I read it twice, thought about it for 3 days, and then wrote back 4 words. "I hope it goes well." I didn't unblock her number. Some doors, I've learned, don't need to be reopened just because someone finally knocks politely. Some doors get to stay closed simply because you're allowed to be done. In October, the hospital's continuing education committee asked me to give a grand rounds lecture, the internal presentations physicians give to each other on topics ranging from rare surgical complications to hospital policy, usually attended by whatever residents and attendings can spare an hour between cases. They asked if I'd be willing to speak, informally, about physician burnout, given the attention the video had drawn and given, as the department chair put it delicately, the unique perspective my situation offered. I said yes, on one condition, that I got to make it about more than my own family. I stood at a podium in the same hospital where I'd once collapsed on a lounge couch alone, and they looked out at a room of nearly 90 physicians, nurses, and residents. And I talked about vasovagal collapse and untreated hypertension, and the statistics on physician suicide, and the quiet epidemic of doctors who treat their own warning signs with the same dismissiveness they'd never once tolerate in a patient. But mostly, I talked about the particular danger of being good at handling things. Every one of us in this room, I said, was, at some point, the kid who got called responsible, mature for your age, independent, Those are compliments when you're 8. They become a trap by the time you're 38, because somewhere along the way, being good at carrying weight starts to look, to everyone around you, like evidence you were never actually carrying anything at all. I collapsed alone on a couch in this building because it did not occur to a single person in this hospital, including me, that the surgeon who never complains might also be a person whose body was screaming for help. I am asking you, as colleagues, to build a culture where competence isn't mistaken for invulnerability. And I'm asking each of you, individually, to notice the people in your own lives who are always fine. Check on them anyway. Priya, sitting in the second row, was crying by the end. So I noticed was Dr. Reyes, quietly in the back. 1 year, almost to the day after I woke up in that ambulance with a paramedic named Colton telling me to stay calm, I stood again in an operating room, gloved and gowned, about to make the first incision on a routine gallbladder removal, the kind of case that had become, over the intervening year, almost soothingly ordinary. Priya assisted. My hands were perfectly steady. Afterward, I drove to Lily's school for her first grade Passion Project presentation, where 7-year-olds stood up one by one to talk about what they wanted to be when they grew up. Lily, in a purple dress she'd chosen herself, stood in front of her classmates holding a poster board covered in markered drawings of a hospital, a stick-figure surgeon with a stethoscope, and, unmistakably, gap-toothed and grinning even in crayon, a small axolotl wearing a tiny cape. "When I grow up," she announced to the room, "I want to be a doctor like my mom, because my mom saves people, and she always shows up, even when it's hard." I sat in the front row, exactly where I'd promised Marcus I'd be, and I cried the good kind of tears, the kind that don't cost anything, the kind nobody has ever billed me for. Eleanor was there too, in the seat beside me, 81 years old that October, still steady, still showing up every single Sunday without fail. My father has never called again. My mother sent one email in August, forwarded through Deborah's office, asking whether I might reconsider, for the sake of the family. I didn't respond. Some questions, I've learned, don't deserve the dignity of an answer, because answering them at all implies there's still a negotiation happening. And there isn't. Not anymore. My savings account, 11 months after I stopped sending $1,400 a month to a house I never lived in, holds $31,600 more than it would have otherwise. Money that's gone, instead, into Lily's college fund, into the Hawaii trip Marcus and I finally took in March, into a life that belongs, for the first time in my adult existence, entirely to the people actually living it. That's the whole story. Not the version where everyone reconciles in a hospital hallway with swelling music, where my parents show up at Lily's kindergarten graduation with tears in their eyes, and everyone forgives everyone, and the credits roll over a family hug. The real version, the only one I actually have, is smaller and harder and, I think, truer than that. A woman spent 33 years bleeding herself dry for people who left her to nearly die alone in a hospital lounge. And the thing that finally saved her wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't forgiveness freely given. It was a spreadsheet. It was a grandmother who refused to stay erased. It was 249 pages of undeniable proof. A paramedic's honest phone call replayed until it stopped being deniable. And one simple, hard-won, 33 years overdue decision to finally stop. I show up for my daughter now. Every recital, every graduation, Every ordinary Tuesday that doesn't require an emergency to earn my presence. That's the whole inheritance I actually wanted to pass down in the end. Not money. Not a story about who deserves to be believed. Just the simple, radical act of showing up, on time, for the people who never should have had to wonder whether you would. Sometimes, late at night, after Lily's asleep and Marcus has already drifted off beside me, I still catch myself doing the old math out of habit, running the numbers on some invisible ledger my parents spent 30 years training me to keep. I've learned to let it pass now instead of acting on it. I remind myself that I don't owe anyone an accounting of my own life anymore. That the ledger closed the night I stood up at that podium and finally told the truth out loud. And then I get up, quietly, and I check on Lily anyway. Not because anything is wrong, not because a crisis is calling me out of bed, but simply because I can. Because nobody has to nearly die for me to notice they matter. She's always fine. She's always just sleeping, one arm thrown over Waffle, entirely unaware of the woman standing in her doorway who finally learned what it means to show up for no reason at all except love.